You're listening to The Look Back Machine. I'm your host, Jake Cannon. And now it's time again to take a revealing peek back into history.
Where are we going this time?
The year 1959. The place, Hollywood.
You know, he's raised communist, basically. His parents were communists. You know, his grandfather was blacklisted.
It would be difficult to start anywhere else than that quote by Joe. It's the best quote. Joe's words fill the mind with scenes of Paul's parents singing communist lullabies over his crib, with a mobile of hammer and sickles above his infant head, and a stuffed Karl Marx doll held close to his chest. Joe's quote is short, it's powerful, it's bold, and it's funny. If it had been Paul was raised Catholic or Mormon or Republican, it's not nearly as potent. Not only that, it's a quote if said in the 1950s would have ended Paul's career. The only problem with the quote is it doesn't happen to be entirely true.
You know, that's an exaggeration.
Throughout their story, there will be many competing narratives, misinformation, over-exaggeration, as in this case, and sometimes flat-out lies. It calls to mind Pliny the Younger, who wrote letters to Cornelius Tacitus detailing Mount Vesuvius's eruption, which destroyed the city of Pompeii in the year 79. This is the only account of that event from an eyewitness in history. In effect, Pliny's version is the oral history of Pompeii's destruction. One guy, one story. As far as we know, he was the first to tell the story. He was the last to tell the story. But had there been another eyewitness whose letters had survived to the modern age, rest assured that they would say Pliny the Younger was full of crap. So enjoy these stories that these people remember to be true. But beware of the great quote, because no matter how flashy, it does not tell the whole story. But the danger is it can be the only thing that people remember, especially if it has the great fortune of being said first. And so Paul was raised not exactly communist.
My grandfather was a Stalinist. He wasn't a communist, but he was a Stalinist. He would get angry when people would criticize Stalin. And this is in the 1980s. The Soviet Union itself had condemned him 25 or 30 years before.
My grandfather was a guy named Simon Lazarus. He was a theater owner in Los Angeles. He was a Russian immigrant, self-educated. He was never officially in the Communist Party, but he supported a lot of leftist causes. And in the 1950s, when the blacklist happened, my grandfather was friends with the Hollywood 10 and other blacklisted people. And my grandfather and a bunch of those guys got together and decided they were going to make a movie called The Salt of the Earth. He became a producer on this movie. For doing that, I believe, if I have my chronology right, this is all but way before I was born, my grandfather was called before the California Un-American Activities Committee, where he took the Fifth Amendment and refused to answer any of the questions on the grounds that it might incriminate him. And after that, they tried to blacklist him, but if you're a director or a writer, an actor, it's very easy to blacklist you because they can just say, we're not hiring you, we'll hire somebody else. You're out of luck. But my grandfather owned the theaters. They needed him, so they couldn't really do anything to him. So he got a lot of threats. He got bomb threats and scary phone calls and letters, but the studios themselves couldn't do anything to him because he owned the theaters and they needed access to those theaters. So he was not really hurt.
I was born here in Los Angeles, in Hollywood, as a matter of fact. When I was about 10 years old, my family moved to San Diego for about 6 years, and we moved back to Los Angeles. Never stayed in a house longer than about 6 years. We were just moving all the time. I just always loved movies my whole life. My favorite film was The Third Man. I loved the great films of the 70s, you know, The Godfather, Chinatown, you know, kind of gritty, more realistic stuff, and really interested in storytelling and using movies to tell stories. I kind of was interested in animation when I was younger, and I remember that they used to show Eastern European films on the local PBS station in San Diego, and I kind of loved those crazy Eastern European kind of grungy animated movies from that period. I just remember thinking, oh, those are kind of cool. They're not nicey nice, you know? Like you think of Disney animated movies and they're all kind of sweet. All the characters have way big eyes and they're kind of sentimental. Not my thing. The Eastern European stuff was ugly and kind of mean and funny and black humor. But animation was never a particular interest of mine. I'm not fond of Disney animated movies. They were never my thing. Disney was kind of an anti-Semite. My parents knew about that. My parents wouldn't let me go to Disney movies when I was a kid. You know, I'm exactly the right age, and I never saw Mary Poppins until I was an adult because my parents thought that was garbage. And you know, I kind of think they're right. I admire the single vision of this guy and it being a creative vision and not merely a cynical. I mean, he was a money grubbing, awful guy in a lot of ways, but he really did have a vision. He had an idea of the world he wanted to present visually on the screen. And I sort of admire that. I think it's an ugly American version of the world that I don't like and never have. We watched cartoons on Saturday morning. Everybody did in my generation. And I liked them fine, but it wasn't something I ever had any big ambition to be involved in. I was interested in movies. I wanted to make movies, live action movies. I stumbled into animation in kind of a funny way. I was studying economics at Berkeley. And then in the late 1970s, when I was a junior in college, I realized, God, I hate economics. My politics was kind of left and I wasn't interested in it. And I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. And then I needed a bunch of credits to graduate the year that I wanted to. And so there was a summer course at UCLA in filmmaking. And I thought, hey, I can get 8 units for that course. I'll take that. So I took the class. I loved it. I really connected with the teacher. I asked him if he'd write me a recommendation for graduate school. And so I graduated in economics the next year, 1980, and went immediately to film school, started film school at UCLA. So I just knew this is what I wanted to do, but it wasn't something I ever even thought about until my junior year in college.
Germain's writing partner, Joe Ansolabehere, was born 12 days after Paul, on June 18, 1959. Joe comes from a very left place, but still marvels at Paul's family history. He's like a childhood friend that thinks your family is so cool because you eat dinner with the television on.
My dad wasn't really a communist. He wasn't like Paul. Paul was really raised in the middle of it. Like his grandfather was blacklisted and stuff. Paul's named Paul because of Paul Robeson, and that was a family friend. So it was like he was really communist. I mean, his grandfather was a communist, out and out communist. And I was just raised by a liberal guy. My dad was a school teacher, and then he, he wanted something more, I guess. And so we moved down here the summer of '65. We came out down here for the Watts riots, basically. Then we went to Detroit for the riots. And then we went to Champaign, Illinois, just missed the Kent State riots. We were just looking for wherever the politics was happening. He was actually just getting higher education. He was getting his master's degree and his PhD and stuff.
Joe's family history is not rich with Hollywood tales, spies, or the FBI. So there's only a couple things to remember about Joe's childhood.
I have a bad thing in my family of quitting jobs. I'm the guy. My dad was a kind of a bit of a job quitter, and I'm a bit of a job quitter too. Where I'll just say, enough. Either you do it this way, or I'm going to quit. And then eventually people won't do it your way, and then he's like, well, I'm quitting then. Paul and I both have the same thing. We're very loud. We're both the oldest of all boys. There were 5 boys in my family and 4 boys in his family, and yelling and screaming and hitting is kind of how you say stuff to each other.
I always wrote. I think I always had it in my head that I was going to be doing something with movies. So when I was in high school, I remember saying I wanted to write a screenplay, which I didn't even know what one was. This is like the 70s, and it wasn't like the days when everybody was writing a screenplay. But I just said, how do you do that? And my teacher said, well, I'll get you a screenplay. And she got me a screenplay. I had no idea what I was doing, and I tried to write a screenplay, and it was really bad. So I was always going to be like a high school teacher or something. I always loved history, which I think is just when you're in school and you like stories, that's a place to go. So I was going to the University of Nevada to be a history teacher, but I never could get film out of my mind. I just loved films.
Like their television shows, their personal stories take on a cinematic quality, especially the events that altered the course of their lives. There are 2 events that shaped Joe. The first positions him as a Benjamin Braddock character, drifting in the wind.
There was this film class that I took over and over, a guy named Howard Rosenberg. He always taught this film class, and I took every film class over and over, Hitchcock, horror films, whatever. And I kept taking the class over and over, and he finally said, you can't take the class anymore. I was like, yeah, but there are always new movies. I want to watch movies. It's like, you can't. But I would still go to the class. And I had a lot of friends in the class. And so this one night, my friends were in the class, but they were taking a final. So I went outside and I was sitting on the steps. And this woman walked up the steps, and she probably about 40, but I thought this was an older woman, but she was really beautiful, blonde woman. And she went in and she looked in the class, and she came out and she was pacing around like she was waiting for somebody from the class. And I said, oh, they're taking a final. It'll be a while. And she goes, oh. And she was kind of pacing around. And she said, so what are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm just waiting for my friend. She said, but what are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm a history major, but I want to be a filmmaker. And it was the first time I'd ever said it. I'd never spoken it out loud. I don't know why I said it to this woman. I don't know who she was. And she said, well, what are you doing here then? You should be at USC or UCLA. And I thought, I shouldn't I? People like say things like that, and all of a sudden that changes your life.
And then there are the other events that are abrupt and life-changing in a way that is unspeakable, that films can never quite capture.
And then some other things happened. I had a brother who died around that time in a car accident who I really loved. And I think all these things sort of conspired to make me think that I didn't want to waste my life, that every day is precious and I wanted to do what I want to do. So anyway.
And so now Paul and Joe were both at UCLA. The UCLA film program had the newly acquired distinction of being the alma mater of Francis Ford Coppola. The director had quickly come to fame in the 1970s by directing The Godfather, Godfather Part 2, and Apocalypse Now, while having directed Tonight for Sure in 1962, a softcore pornographic film. Coppola was now part of a cinematic revolution called the New Hollywood, along with directors like Martin Scorsese, Peter Bogdanovich, Hal Ashby, and Robert Altman. Their films were grittier, darker, and artist-driven. Directors were given far greater autonomy than they were accustomed to. In the late 1960s, the once tried-and-true formula of epics with epic stars had seen catastrophic financial failures. At 20th Century Fox, Cleopatra almost bankrupted the studio. As smaller films became giant successes, the studios increased their independent productions, hoping for another low-budget cultural phenomenon like Easy Rider. The film was directed by drug-crazed Dennis Hopper. The drug use on camera was real, the drug use off camera was real, and it was a major hit. On his next film, The Last Movie, part of his directorial preparation was to plot out which drug to take during which scene. The result was a disaster. Like Hopper's directorial success, 70s filmmaking was as iconic as it was ephemeral. The studios soon realized that the only thing more important than artistic prestige was money. This epiphany came in the form of the box office juggernaut Jaws, directed by New Hollywood filmmaker Steven Spielberg. Then came Star Wars and Star Wars toys, and the studios returned to bigger blockbusters. But now they were marketed at high school crowds and children rather than adults, a process that would be further expanded upon by Disney's Marvel Universe, when several franchises would effectively intertwine. The blockbuster could change a studio's fortune in one foul swoop, and the right franchise could last forever, which left 70s filmmaking out in the cold.
Joe and I, one of the ways that we connect is we both loved the films of the 70s. Well, we were living that, that just, it was so vibrant and rich and exciting, and the politics was just our politics. And we go, that's what we want to do. But by the time we started film school in 1980, all that was over. We didn't know it, but it was over. The dying breath of 70s films was Raging Bull. And that bombed. After that, we were into the 80s and it was a whole other ballgame. But we didn't know that. We were in film school. We thought it was just going to keep going.
Unaware of the seismic shift in the industry, Paul and Joe were about to meet. Neither of the two remember their first meeting. Based on their current relationship, you'd expect Dreamweaver to have been playing in the background.
We had a lot of mutual friends, but we hadn't had a lot of classes together. He was kind of in the writing program and I was in the production program, and we didn't really know each other. And then both of us ended up working at audiovisual services at UCLA, which are the guys that came in with the projectors and the stuff. We became friends there, but we weren't really that close. We considered ourselves friends, but not important friends, He
was just a guy I knew from film school. I liked him, he was a friend, but we weren't that close.
Strangely enough, they were both better friends with a guy by the name of Steve Vixton. And Steve Vixton deserves special attention. There's a story that best describes him, and also gives you an idea of the work that Paul and Joe appreciated. But it happens in the future, when Steve was writing on a Nickelodeon television show by the name of Hey Arnold. And it has to do with Christmas. And Vietnam.
I'll tell you that story. So that's Steve. That's kind of like a good description of who Steve is, but it's also kind of an interesting way of like how weird things happen. So the thing with Steve was, and I loved Steve. I really loved this guy, but he was a strange guy. He was an odd duck. And the most important thing was the art, the writing, and getting what his worldview was across, right? And so there was going to be a Christmas episode coming up, and Steve was stumped. I was listening to him, and he was telling me that he wanted to do this Secret Santa thing, and he wanted to do somebody in the apartment building that Arnold was going to give a gift, but he wasn't sure what the gift was, and how would that be in a whole half hour? He wasn't sure what to do. And I don't know why I had the thought, but he had been pitching also for years this story about Mr. Win, who was the Vietnamese guy in the apartment building, finding out that his daughter, who he had left on the top of the building in Vietnam, as the helicopters were going off, that he somehow reconnects with his daughter, and Arnold helps him reconnect. And it kept getting rejected, this story, but Steve kept saying he wanted to do it. This is classic Steve. So I said, why don't you take that story and make that the Christmas story? We'd worked together so long. We kind of knew what the other guy was thinking all the time. And I just saw him smile. And he said to me, do you think they would let me do that? And I said, I don't know. But if you did, that would be the first Christmas show that I've ever seen where you cut to Vietnam, and for sure the first animated Christmas show I've ever seen where you cut to Vietnam. So what happened is he went off and he wrote this script. Somehow he got this thing through. I don't know how he did it. And they kept approving it with notes, and he kept changing it, adjusting it, and finally he got a really good version of the way he liked it, all the way through animatic, which, if you know what an animatic is, it's like a film storyboard with sound. And then the executives saw it. And then they all went, what the hell is this? We didn't approve this. And Steve said, oh, yes, you did. No, we didn't. Now, they haven't animated it yet. They could pull the plug right here. And Steve begged them to at least give it a chance. So Catherine Weitz took the tape home and thinking, I don't know if I want to do this or not. I'm not sure if this is a good idea. And her son, who was, I guess, like 8 or 9 years old, he watched the first 11 minutes, which ends with the Vietnam scene, which is very emotional. If you've ever seen it, it's an amazing piece of filmmaking. And the little girl gets separated from her dad, and the dad holds up his little girl, little baby, and
I beg the soldier, please take us. Have us fight a new life. But he could not. He said there was only room for one of us. Then I had to make the most difficult decision of my life. I knew I had to do the best thing for Mai. I knew if I gave Mai to the soldier, they would take care of her. They would find a home for her. And then, as soon as I could, I would get out of the country and find her again. As the helicopter left, the soldier called out the name of a city.
The soldier takes it and takes the baby, and the helicopter flies off, and it ends with Mr. Wynn saying, I know she's in the United States somewhere, but I don't know how to find her. And then the 11 minutes ends with Arnold saying, I'm going to find this little girl, for Mr. Wynn. That's going to be his Christmas present. Very emotional. And supposedly the little boy, Catherine's son, watched the end of it and turned to his mom and said, is that what Vietnam was all about, Mom? Is that how it happened? And what Steve said happened was that Catherine told him, she just thought in that moment, okay, we're going to let him do it. So, again, I'm the only one telling this story now, but if Steve was alive still, I'm sure he'd say, oh yeah, I remember that, because that was such a big deal to him. Because I remember him telling me the story,
It was getting toward the summer of 1983. I was at a party this friend of mine threw, and I was talking to him, and I said, hey, I'm looking for a job for the summer. Do you know anything? And he said, actually, I do. I'm a PA on Taxi. The show's coming to an end right now, and the executive producer partners on that show are all kind of going in different directions. 2 of them are doing a new TV series, and the third one is doing a movie, but it doesn't look like it's going anywhere. All of us have gone over to work on the other TV show. The guy who's doing the feature, he needs some PAs. Would you be interested in doing that? I said, sure, I'd love to do that. That other producer was Jim Brooks, right? So I went in and I interviewed, and his secretary looks at my resume and she said, gee, you graduated in economics from Berkeley and you're at UCLA Film School? You're kind of overqualified for this PA job. And I looked at her and I said, I will do anything. I will clean toilets. I'll do whatever you want. Please hire me. And she said, you really want this? And I said, yeah, I really want it. I don't care. And she said, okay. And she hired me.
Paul ended up in the perfect place for his predilections. the production company of James L. Brooks. Brooks began as a page at CBS, then became a news writer, but left as the young and crazy do for Hollywood. He jumped to an unstable job working on documentaries for David Wolper. The job inevitably fell through, and Brooks was out of work. Later on, Brooks reflected back on the period. I don't know if this is true for everybody, but I had this image of a job I'd have to get if I couldn't get the job I chose. For me, it was always selling shoes. Either I got a good job, or I sold shoes. There seemed to be nothing else in between. But I met Alan Burns socially, and I wrote a spec script for a show he'd created, My Mother the Car. That sold, and I started to pick up a few more. I did That Girl, I did Hey Landlord, and within a year and a half, I'd created Room 222. It went very quickly right in there. He would go on to develop Mary Tyler Moore with Burns, and that would put him on the map for the rest of his life. In the 70s, he would also create Lou Grant, Rhoda, and Taxi. The shows were progressive and character-based, and they changed television. After his success on the small screen, Brooks attempted to break into movies. But in trying to master his first script, he noted it was the hardest thing he ever wrote in his life. The difficulties would continue from script to screen, and the film Terms of Endearment would take 4 years to come to life. The studio it would eventually land at was part advantage and part disadvantage. When Brooks couldn't crack the script before deadline, he asked Paramount Studios to exercise the option on the script so he could finish writing it. They agreed. When Brooks finally finished, the reaction wasn't positive. Brooks found himself explaining that the film was a comedy even though it was about cancer. In fact, Brooks himself thought if he couldn't get a laugh on the word cancer, the script wouldn't work. There were also deeper ideological issues to overcome at Paramount Studios. In 1974, owner Charles Bluedorn hired Barry Diller, then 32, to be chairman and chief executive of Paramount. He had gained fame at ABC TV for the miniseries Roots and the movie of the week. In 1976, Diller hired Michael Eisner as president of Paramount Pictures. Eisner was the writer and practitioner of the Paramount Coda, which he released in a company memo in 1981. It read, "We have no obligation to make art. We have no obligation to make history. We have no obligation to make a statement. But to make money, it is often important to make history, to make art, or to make some significant statement. In order to make money, we must always make entertaining movies. And if we make entertaining movies, at times we will reliably make history, art, a statement, or all three. We cannot expect numerous hits, but if every film has an original and imaginative concept, then we can be confident some will break through. We should generally resist making expensive overall deals with box office stars and top directors, because we can attract them later on with strong material." Eisner wanted high-concept films which you could easily pitch in an elevator. He preferred low-budget films that could be singles or doubles. But he wasn't immune to the glitz and glamour of the home run. The studio, after all, did pick up Indiana Jones from Lucas and Spielberg. Eisner loved the low-budget hit. But the content had changed in the 80s. The films were now easier to digest. Flashdance, Footloose, Beverly Hills Cop, 48 Hours. There were still challenging films, but even David Lynch made a straightforward narrative for Paramount with The Elephant Man. To put it more succinctly, Rosemary's Baby was now Friday the 13th. The budgetary policy would directly affect Terms of Endearment and almost stop it from being made. In an interview with Film Comment, Brooks said, "Then after 6 or 7 months after the script was done, Michael Eisner wrote this note. Okay, we're going to make your picture. And I said, put it in writing. So he put Terms of Endearment. Go picture at $7.5 million. Delivery, Xmas of 82. And he signed it. I permaplacked it. The movie would not budget out at 7.5. Even with closing your eyes here and there, it would not budget out. Paramount felt that he had to draw the line someplace. So $7.5 million he said, $7.5 million he meant, $7.5 million I couldn't do it for unless I was willing to not make a location picture, which I was unwilling to do. So the picture went into turnaround. Everybody turned it down. Nobody even took a meeting with me. Nobody called me in and said, well, we might be interested if you could get so-and-so. Just absolute cold turndowns. One exception, Paula Weinstein and Willie Hunt, who were at MGM and UA under David Begelman, said they'd like to do it, but there was a certain amount of turmoil going on at their company. I could never quite get people on the phone. I could never quite get a drive onto the lot. Then, nobody was there, and I was dead. But I still had my office here at Paramount. And I was speaking to Michael Eisner, and he said, I still like it. I still like it for 7.5. Then my agent thought of MTM, the production company of Mary Tyler Moore, for the money that I needed, and Arthur Price agreed. He said to me later that his associates told him he was crazy to make the investment. He said, I don't expect to make money, but I think it will do well enough to where we will break even. By fighting to make the film he wanted to make and not compromising, Brooks delivered a hit to Paramount. Terms grossed over $100 million and won 5 Oscars, including Best Director and Best Picture.
But they didn't know that. Nobody knew that it was going to be this big thing. The film had already gone through production and it was just in post. So I was the PA on post on that movie. I was never on the set or anything for it. I did whatever I was told and stayed out of the way. My idea was do what you're told, learn what you can, be quiet, be a little mouse in the background. Don't be noticeable. But one of the things that Brooks used to do is he used to ask me to drive him to and from his house, right? One day, he asked me to drive him home, and he said, listen, I'm having a screening of the movie, and I'd like you to come to it. And I thought, wow! There's this major motion picture. I was so blown away. So I went to see the movie, and it was an early cut of the movie, and it didn't work for me. And I'm sitting there watching it, and I kind of snuck out when the screening ended because I thought, I don't want to tell my boss that it doesn't work for me. So the next day, his secretary calls me and says, Jim wants you to pick him up at his house in Malibu and drive him back to the studio. And I thought, oh, shit. So I go to pick him up, and I prepare like some banal things to say because I don't want to tell him, I don't want to, who am I to criticize? I mean, he's Jim Brooks, and I'm like some little putz out of film school, So I have these little niceties, and I pick him up, and we're talking a little bit, and as I drive him, it's just him and me in the car, and he started asking me questions about what I thought about the screening. I remember just trying to say kind of banal lies. Who was I to criticize him? And he just kept asking me questions rapid fire until I could not come up with little niceties quickly enough. And so finally I just started saying what I thought, and he would just listen. He didn't get angry. He just listened to what I had to say. And then lo and behold, he implemented some of the things I said in his movie. I couldn't believe it. I could not believe it. He was always like that. He was always really open to hearing what people had to say and allowing the possibility that they might have something to contribute. It's kind of a valuable lesson, right? Nobody is an idiot who doesn't have anything to say. Nobody's an ignorant little putz who doesn't have anything to say. Everyone has value. It's kind of a way he operates, and I think it shows in his movies.
The world of Hollywood was beginning to enchant Paul Germain.
I remember I got a burger for Jack Nicholson once, and he said to me, "Thanks, kid." And I still remember that. It was a big deal for me. One time I was sitting, so he had a secretary, a woman by the name of Barbara Duncan, who worked for him for years and years and years. And well, sometimes she'd go to lunch and I would take over while she was at lunch. But I remember one time I was at his desk and I was sitting there, and this woman walks in, and it's Carole King. And he comes out and he greets her, and they go into his back office where he had a piano, and she starts playing Carole King songs and singing. And the door's half open, and I'm hearing Carole King sing the songs of the 70s that I remember from being a kid, and hearing Jim every once in a while go, "Great, that's great," like that. And I thought, this is the weirdest experience ever. So I had a lot of experiences like that. I don't remember the first time I ever met Brooks, but he was kind of an amazing figure and this person who could do anything and revered by everyone who worked with him. After Terms of Endearment, he kind of formed a company and called it Gracie Films, and I was there for 6 years. And in fact, I never graduated film school. I kept taking a leave of absence, and eventually it ran out. I never went back. So that's how I got into the film business.
Paul went off and got basically an internship with working with James L. Brooks, and we were all like, "See you later, Paul, see you on September, okay, bye." And then he just never came back, so he was gone. And one of his really close friends was Steve Bixton. And he and I just started hanging out all the time and talking about movies, and lived in a garage next to John Lee Mahon's. He's an old screenwriter from the 30s. And he would say, "That's John Lee Mahon right next door." I was like, "No way," because we'd watched his movies. But anyway, I would stop on the hill because I had this old Volkswagen and I had to put oil in it. Like I could only get over the hill. I had to put as much oil as gas, basically. So like the oil would just run right through. So I had to like put in a can of oil, and then I could get up to Steve's house and I'd put another can of oil because I couldn't get my car fixed. But I'd stop at Steve's house and we would just talk about movies. And I had all these theories, we both had all these theories, and we would talk about all these crazy things. And then just this one day, I was telling him about the script I was writing. He said, "I should write a script too." And then he wrote a script. And then he had an idea for a script, and we started working on it together. And then next thing I knew, we were selling scripts all over town. We were like, it wasn't even that hard. We thought, oh, this is easy. We'll get a movie made in no time. And it never happened. And we wrote one called Surfin' CIA that was really successful and did well, Anyway, wrote a bunch of these screenplays, and around 87 or 88, it seemed like things were kind of coming to an end. We really weren't sure what to do. Like, we weren't able to sell, and we were like, we've been doing this for like 4 years, and we thought we should have gotten something made. So the writer's strike hit in 87, 88, and I was like, oh my God, and I just had a baby on the way, and I thought, oh my God, I can't keep this going, what am I going to do? So, and it was actually an interesting way of getting into animation kind of from the side, because what happened was I had never really thought that animation would be something I was going to do, but I always loved animation. I loved Warner Brothers, especially when I was a kid. But when I was in film school, it seemed like everybody I knew was involved with animation. My roommate was an animator, like David Silverman was there, from The Simpsons. There's a really great animation school going on there. And because my roommate, Neil Richmond, was an animator, I had great respect for it. And I was going and hanging out at the animation department and seeing these kids drawing this stuff they draw right on the film. I was like, wow, like who else was actually dealing with the actual physical film, Animators. I remember going to class, and I remember I was watching Morocco, Marlene Dietrich and Gary Cooper, and it was this beautiful print, and it was so gorgeous, and we were all watching the movie, and it was amazing. And then the movie ended, and I was with my professor, and he got up to leave, and I said, aren't you going to stay and watch the Fleischer movies, And he said, what, really? And I said, oh, they're amazing. And he sat down, he looked at me and said, I don't know how you can watch this shit, and turned and left. And I thought, wow, people don't respect this, but this is great. So around that time, I wasn't sure what to do, wasn't sure how to get a job, and I started working just at UCLA with some other friends, just like in the medical department, thinking, oh, I'll do something else for a living. This isn't going to work. And around that time, this friend of mine, that roommate, said, hey, there's going to be a movie playing this weekend, and we're all going to go to the movie. Why don't we go down to Westwood and go to the movie? And it was Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And I didn't really know that this was going to be the beginning of something, which I kind of think is the point. You never know when something's going to change. So we all went to see Roger Rabbit, and there was this guy, Charlie Gibson, who was a guy I knew, and we're all talking afterwards, and he said, what'd you think of that movie? And we just kind of hit it off talking about the movie. And then Charlie said, I started a company called Rhythm and Hues. Would you be interested in being a producer? And I said, well, what does a producer do? And he said, can you type? And I said, yeah. And he said, you could be a producer. And I was like, okay. And I started being a producer at Rhythm and Hues, and it was really exciting times because things were breaking, things were changing. Like I remember John Lasseter coming down, and talking to them and pitching things. I remember Chris Falusi showing up and pitching, but we were making commercials, and they were just starting to get into film.
Paul, meanwhile, was being groomed for an executive role at Brooks.
There was a little bit of a disconnect there because that's not really what I was interested in. I was interested in the creative side of things. I couldn't get my act together to try writing a sample, which would have been the smart thing to do. I was on track to be like a young executive or maybe like a line producer, which was a big mistake. If you were to get anywhere creatively at that company, you really wanted to be a writer. I had the opportunities, but I was too much of a dumbass to take advantage of them back then. I spent a lot of time as a script reader and, writing coverage, which they appreciated, right? Because they liked my taste. Brooks liked my taste. And one day, a book came through called Confederacy of Dunces. I read this book and I loved it. I just loved it. And I went to my immediate boss, a guy named Richard Sakai, and I told him how much I loved this book. Brooks read the book, and so he asked me to come into his office. And he said, well, I read a little bit of it, and I kind of have some issues with it. And I said, oh, okay, yeah, well, what are they? And he said, this doesn't make sense to me, and I kind of think this would make it very difficult to write a feature. What do you think of that? And I said, well, I think you made some good points, Yeah, maybe that would be a problem. And he said, what do you think of? Then I said, yeah, those seem like legitimate issues. And so he said, okay, thanks. And I left. And as I came out, my immediate boss, Richard, said to me, what happened? And I said, well, I told him why I thought it was a great book. And he said, but he had some problems with it. And he said, when he presented those problems, what did you say? I said, well, I told him I thought he had some good points. Some of those things were real problems. And he said, did you propose any solutions? And I said, well, no one asked me to propose solutions. And he said, oh, you really screwed that up. And I said, why? And he said, he was going to figure out if you would be the guy to write that script. And I said, oh my God. So I was being tested and I didn't know it. It was too dumb and naive to see that that's what that was about and to say, let me think about that or I'll come back with a solution. Just didn't do it. Even though I had been bold in many ways and as a student at UCLA, working for him, I was in awe of him and all the other people there. And I didn't understand that what was expected of me was to take the bull by the horns and come up with creative stuff and make it work and show what I could do and prove it and demand it, which I think is what you need to do in Hollywood. There's no room for insecurity. There's no room for modesty. It's a place where you have to be aggressive. You have to decide what you want. You have to go after it. You have to let nothing get in your way. I really was wasn't in that space at that time. That's not where my head was at. And I didn't do that. And it was a tremendous mistake. I wasted 6 years not taking advantage of opportunities that I was at the time too naive to see.
In our next episode, an opportunity falls into Paul's lap, which sets in motion the longest-running animated television show in history. You can find bonus material for the Look Back Machine on patreon.com. Our address is patreon.com/lookbackmachine. There's bonus episodes, live shows, and more, all for a small fee. Or you can check us out on our website, lookbackmachine.tumblr.com. I'd like to thank Matt Brousseau for cleaning up the audio files, and Chris Crittenden for cleaning up a few as well. You can check out Matt's podcast, Bleak in Review, on iTunes. The Look Back Machine artwork was expertly crafted by Chris Palmer. Special thanks to Pat Barker, Jesse Refson, Rishi Aria, Onelli Flores, Nick Taravella, and Greg Gonzalez. Eric Rocha was also an instrumental part in the editing of this podcast. I could not have done it without him. Love and gratitude goes to Donut for keeping me sane during this process and being a quiet sleeper as I conducted interviews. And of course to Paul and Joe for letting me tell their story.